All right, hey everybody. So we're gonna be starting really soon. So this is our first meeting of the new year. We're gonna be going over loops and arrays, um, in like Python and in general programming too. So very quickly, this is gonna be like the format of like today's meeting. So intro, we'll go over the loops, we'll go over arrays, and then we'll show some Python code, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to like do some practice. We might not, depending on time, and then we'll be done. This is like our tentative schedule. So remember, it's every other week. So today's the 5th. We won't see you guys next week, but we will have a meeting on the 19th. Um, if there are any like Suzanne related events or something on like Tuesdays or days we have a meeting, um, you guys could just like email us or something because we might not be like too aware of it. But we have like kind of checked with like the district's calendars and everything. So this should be like pretty accurate, hopefully. And then the Python cheat sheet is in the website. It's also in the Google Classroom in case you guys like are a bit rusty or you guys want to catch up a bit. And also, last thing before we get into the loops and the lessons today, this is probably going to be like our last Python lesson or one of the last ones. We don't want to teach too much Python and just Python. We only wanted to teach the basics. So very likely next time we're going to be starting to teach something new. Most likely we're going to be dealing with like website development, which hopefully maybe you guys aren't too familiar with, but that's okay. But so first we're going to talk about loops. So the two main loops in like programming are for loops and while loops. But first, this is like loops in general, right? So this is like a satellite image of from Google Maps, which shows like the field behind Suzanne. So hopefully you guys like kind of recognize it if you've like went to Suzanne in person before. So before like COVID happened, we used to have like P, right? And we used to have to run like the mile every week or so. And so this is just like an analogy that I'm going to use to like explain loops. I'm assuming most of you guys understand how like a loop works. So basically, for example, if we had to run like 6 laps, instead of like doing like the same thing over and over again, so instead of like copy and pasting your code, for example, 6 times, you can like use a loop, right, to run 6 laps. Um, so that's just like a basic loop. However, there are two like more specific types of loops that we're going to get more in depth about. So the first one is like a for loop. The for loop, so these bullets on the left are pretty important. So there's a set number of iterations. Iterations is like loops. Each loop is one iteration. And you know the loop is executing n times. N is like bolded because n is like a number, basically. It's like a variable. And there's like a diagram of how a for loop works. That was pretty confusing, especially if you like haven't seen one of these before. So instead, we're gonna go back to like this example of like the mile. So let's say like we know that we need to run 6 laps like to get enough credit for the class that day. So what you would do is you would write a for loop that loops until you've hit 6 laps, right? Until you've hit 6 basically. So what it basically do is it would start at the first lap. So you finish the first lap, it would loop, you finish the second lap, loop, third lap, loop, so on. And then once you reach the 6th lap, it checks and it realizes that, hey, you've hit the 6th lap, and it'll break and it'll stop and the loop will be ended, and then your program or your loop would like terminate basically. And so that's like how a for loop basically works. It's pretty simple. If you guys have any questions, you guys can let me know. um, it actually sounds just like a regular loop. However, there's some differences with a for loop and a while loop, which we're going to get into. So this is like another example. These are like the basketball courts. But basically, if you remember, there was also another like running activity we used to do occasionally. It was the pacer test. So the pacer test was like that fitness test. We had to run back and forth like a basketball court, and then you had to make sure you like fit within like the beeps of like the intervals or something. But basically, the difference here is that with the pacer test, you don't know how many laps you're going to be running. So if you wanted to write a for loop for it, you couldn't write it because you don't know how many like back and forths you're going to be looping around, because the pacer test doesn't have like a set number. It instead like you keep on running until you're tired and you quit, or you keep on running until you don't make it within the time interval. So hopefully that makes sense, more or less. So that's where the main difference between a for loop and while loop comes. With a while loop, like you don't know how many times you're going to be running. So this is a diagram of while loop. It's much more simple. Basically, just note over here that there's a Boolean condition and you're unsure of how many iterations. So in the example I just used, the Boolean condition would be, right, you would keep on looping as long as you aren't tired and you don't quit, and you make it within the time interval of each back and forth. And that's like the main advantage of a while loop between a for loop, right? So all you need to really know is that a for loop, you know how many times you're going to be iterating, you know the amount of loops you're going to have. With a while loop, you're not too sure. And instead, you want to do something until some event happens, until some Boolean condition reaches true or false. So if you have any questions, you guys can let me know. These are two like pretty important concepts, I'd say, and you see these loops like very often as the more you program. And so I'm gonna just go right into arrays. So arrays are also important. They're almost like just as important, if not more important. They're basically a container or collection of objects slash values. So unfortunately, I couldn't find like a really good example for arrays. So instead, we just have this picture here. So what we have here is basically like it's an integer array. The reason why we use integer is because it holds integers, right? So you see the value, this top row. These top row are all numbers or integers to be specific, and this is the value that it's storing. Uh, yeah, the slides are switching. Uh, anyways, um, the index is basically referring to each element of the array. So when like I use the word element, I'm referring to each specific like box and each specific value. So this array, for example, it has 9 different elements. Wait, uh, what slides do you guys see? Does everyone only see the first slide or?
No, you can see it. Maybe are you on? Maybe they're on
Yeah,
their
we see the
own
array.
slideshow.
Yeah. Here, I'll just stop sharing and reshare just to maybe it'll work. All right, so hopefully that fixed it. If you need to like leave and rejoin, that's also fine. But basically, we're going to continue with the arrays. So this example here, right? So this is an array of length 9 because there are 9 different elements here. You can count them. But basically, the most important thing that's like kind of new is that arrays or most arrays are always going to be zero based, zero index, zero based indexing, however you want to like refer to it, which means that the first index starts at 0. We're not going to get into why that happens. Just know that it starts at 0. So it's a bit counterintuitive, but you have to get used to it. So like try to force yourself to like memorize that like the first element of an array, the index is 0. The second element, the index is 1. Right. So the ninth element, the index is 8. So if you want to like refer to a certain element, you would make sure you have the index of the value. So if I want to change like the value of 98, I would have to grab the index, which is 4, and we'll have to work with that. But we'll get into that later when we show the code. Where it says lower bound and upper bound, just don't worry about those. We're not gonna like talk about them. We're not gonna like mention them at all. So all you need to know is that arrays like store different values. They can store basically any value. It doesn't have to be an integer. It could be a string. It could be a boolean. It could be whatever. And then the length of array is simply how many elements are in the array. And the array stores the values of whatever type of array it is. And the index is 0 base starting at 0. So like because it's 0 base, one last thing is that the very last element, the index of the very last element is always going to be the array's length minus 1. So for example, this array, the length is 9 and the very last element's index, right, is 8, 9 minus 1. And so that's about it for like these explanations that we have. If you like are really confident and you like know what you're doing, you already like know the code for all of this stuff, you guys can start working on these two problems. I'll send the link in the chat. They're still in our HackerRank contest. Otherwise, if you're like unsure or you are don't know exactly like what the code is, just keep on watching and Lucas is gonna demonstrate the code.
Okay, so I'll be going over the code. This is like just the syntax and stuff you'll need to learn for loops and arrays in Python. So this is just a simple for loop. So um, it's gonna sound strange because if you read it, it doesn't make sense for I in range 3, but we'll learn why that is in a minute. So don't worry about this I for right now. This could be any letter. We use I because it doesn't stand for anything. Because usually if you make a variable, you want to use like A or something. But then if you also use A here, it gets really confusing. So normally you use I. And range just means from it just goes up to 3. So what this will do is it should just print hello 3 times. So that's pretty simple. So what I is it's the index of this range. So remember in the slides, it went from 0. It started with 0 and then it ends with 1 less than the number. So if we do this code for I in range 3, print I. Oh, and by the way, something super important. You always have to indent after your for loop. So it's not indent is you press the tab button. Don't try to type spaces and then try to get this indent. You just want to press tab and then nothing else. So if you run this code, it's going to print 0, 1, 2 because it starts with 0 and then it goes 1 and then goes up to 2 because that's 1 before the number here. So there we go, 0, 1, 2. Okay, so another way you can use range is you can give it some parameters. So you can have a start integer, end integer, and then interval. So here I'm not going to print this. Let's see if you guys could find what would this print. So for I in range 10, 22. So remember the left would be start integer, and then the middle number is the stop integer, and then the right is the interval. So try to private message me the answer if you get one. Remember, it starts with the starting number. If there's no starting number, then it starts with 0. But if there's a starting number, it starts with the starting number, and then it doesn't reach the stopping number. It stops like 1 before. Okay. So I'll just tell you. So it's gonna print, or I could just run it. It's going to print 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. Let me make sure I have the right indent. Okay. So it just prints every 2 because that's our interval, and it starts with 10, ends with 18. Okay. So now we're gonna talk about arrays a little bit. So, in Python, you use brackets to define an array. So, it's just kind of a list. Here I have an array named fruits, and I just call it and I just added 3 elements into it: apples, bananas, and pears. So if I had code like this, for I in fruits, print I. So if I had range, our I, remember up here, our I was going to print 0, 1, 2. But if I have for I in fruits, notice I don't type range anymore because you don't need range when you're talking about a list. You only need range if you're talking about like numbers. So what this is gonna do is it's just gonna print. It's gonna go through each element and it's just gonna print it. And remember, the index is 0, 1, 2. So if I were to print the first element or the 0th element of fruits, that's going to be apples. And then the first element is bananas, and then second is pears. Okay, so apples, bananas, pears. So you could use for loops for an array like this. You could also use for loops for a string. So this is just going to split up the word cherry. So it's going to print C first, and then H, and then E, and then R, R, Y. So oops, for I in a string. Or I need to add this as comment because it doesn't. Okay, so it prints cherry like that because it enters after every letter. Okay, so here is just some methods you could use with arrays. So for example, I have our fruits. Let me do this. So you could use append. So or this right here, this is called index. You can select an element from it. So for example, I can print fruits, and then the first element, this would print bananas because it would grab the word that's in the one slot, which is bananas. If I said like 2, that would print pears. Okay. So that's this one. Append is you add an element to it, but it adds to the end. So let's say I wanted to add watermelon, I could just do fruits.append watermelon, and it will be in the list. And then if I wanted to remove something, you have to specify which one you want to remove. So if I wanted to remove watermelon, I could do this. And then the last one that you need to know is the len. So this just tells you the length. So if I did this, if I didn't add watermelon and I did this and I did length of fruits and I printed this, I would get 3 because there's 3 elements. Okay, so there's actually a lot more to arrays and methods. There's like I think 10 methods in Python that you could do with arrays, but we'll just be covering this for now. I think when you look at the Python cheat sheet, there'll be a link to a website that tells you a lot more about loops and arrays if you want to learn about those. Okay, so I think give you guys time to try out the HackerRank now.
All right, so really quickly, I'll just go over like the HackerRank questions. We have about like 15 minutes left, so depending on time, we might go over like solutions at the end. But first, I'll send the link to the first one in the chat again. Make sure that you guys are logged into like your account and that account like has signed up for the SMS Computer Science Club contest, because otherwise you cannot access this challenge. It doesn't really matter which one you do first. Probably just do this one first because it's just first in order, but it doesn't really matter. So problem statement says you're given an array of integers and it's called num, and you have to add an integer, and you're given an integer called target, and I have to return the indices, right? That's basically just the indexes of the two numbers such that they add up to target. So if that's a bit confusing, just like basically just look at the example. So in this example, it gives you this array of numbers, which is 2, 7, 11, and 15. And you need to find two numbers out of these four numbers, or this array of numbers, that add up to 9. So we can see that 2 plus 7 is equal to 9. So our answer would be the index of 2 and the index of 7, which is 0 and 1. Note that the output format is a bit weird. We're printing it with a bracket and a comma and an extra bracket. That you could probably like just do this, just like manually add like a bracket in quotation marks and then a comma in quotation marks with a space and another like closing bracket in quotation marks. If you guys are unsure about how to do that, you guys can let us know. And then in the code, these two lines should be already done for you. So what this line does is basically it's like a complicated, it's not actually not that complicated, but it's all merged into one line. It's actually a for loop, which takes in all of the numbers in the first line and stores it into an array. So num is an array. And then target is just the integer, which is whatever. So for example, sample input 1 target would be 6. And then if you guys have like any questions about this challenge specifically, you can let me know. We're gonna be looking at the second challenge now. So send it in the link in chat again. But basically, the second challenge, it's a bit similar, but you're also given an integer array of numbers from 1 to n. So this part is very important, from 1 to n. And you need to find the missing number from the array. So the first line you're given n, right, which is like the length of the array plus 1. Basically, you're given the number n and you're given n minus 1 more numbers, right? So 5, and you're given 4 more numbers, and this is an array, and you need to find which number from these 4 numbers are missing. So in our example here, from 1 to 5, right, which would normally be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we're missing the number 3. So you need to output 3 somehow. And then same thing with sample input 1. N is equal to 7. So you're given 6 numbers, which are 6, 3, 7, 2, 4, 1. If you look at it a bit more, the number that's missing is 5. 5 is missing from that group of numbers. Note on this side, there is no starter code for you. So like if you want to grab this array and this target and you're like unsure how to, I suggest just copy and pasting these 2 lines here and just like switching the order and putting them into here. And that's about it. So I think we'll give you guys some time and then we'll probably go over solutions to actually probably both of them in about like 7 or 8 minutes. Okay, so we're gonna start, or I'm gonna start like explaining some of the solutions. If you guys are like still working or like not done yet, that's also fine. But I think it'd be good for us to like explain the solutions before we leave today. So hopefully you guys can see my VS Code. So this is like the full solution for the two sum problem. Basically, what it is the top is just like the input stuff, right? So we grab the integers as an array, grab the target integer, and this is where we start our code. So we know we need to find two integers that make up target, right? So one of the most efficient ways to do it is simply to loop through every possible pair of like numbers in that array. So to loop through every possible pair, we're going to have two for loops. So this first for loop loops through every number inside the integer array, starting at I, which is 0. And in the second for loop does the same thing, except it starts at I plus 1. So which means it doesn't start at 1, it starts at I plus 1. So if I,
Okay.
so if it starts at So if it starts at 0, so if I is equal to 0, then j will start at 1. And if I is equal to 1, then j will start at 2, and so on. And the reason why we do that is because we don't need to check any possibility behind. So basically what that means is if you look at an array of numbers and you loop through every single possible pair, and if you start from 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, the numbers I'm saying are the indexes. So if we start with element, right, index 0, index 1, index 0, index 2, index 0, index 3, and then we keep on going, there's no chance we're ever going to need to check the number behind. If that's a bit too confusing, don't worry about it. You can also just duplicate like len num and just like delete this part. It will also work. But just for the sake of purpose, we'll keep it there. And then so this is like commonly known as like a two-pointer approach because basically we're looping through every two possible numbers. And then if, right, that number plus the second number is equal to target, then we print out the answer. And that's about it. So it might be a bit confusing, but what I suggest is like play around with it. We'll be posting all of this code on GitHub later, so you guys can like take a look. So like try implementing it. Note that the brackets and commas are like manually put in quotations to fit the output format. And then we're gonna move on to the second question. So this was missing number. So really quickly, this is like from like an algebra concept. I'm not sure if you guys have learned this, but the sum of like a sequence from 1 to n is always going to be n times n plus 1 divided by 2. So as you can see right here. It's a pretty common used formula, and it's very useful in our scenario right here because the way we can think about it is if we're given like n, right, and we know that we're supposed to have 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way up to n. So if we sum up all of those numbers, right, 1 to n, right, and then if we subtract each number that's given to us, what we're going to be left with is the missing number. So how this works is that you create the sum, right, which is equal to n times n plus 1 divided by 2. Then you loop through every single number inside the array, which is given to you, and you subtract that number from the sum. And then after you're done looping through with everything, you're going to be left with the sum. So I know this one's probably like really confusing, but if we just imagine, so let's say n is equal to 5, right? And they give you the numbers 1, 2, 4, and 5. So basically, off the bat, we know that the sum of all numbers from 1 to 5, right, is equal to 5 times 6 divided by 2, which is equal to 15. And then, so we know that this number, the array should equal to 15. However, it's missing a number. So if we subtract every single one of these numbers from 15, we're going to be left with the missing number. So you can see it in action, right? So 15 minus 1 is equal to 14. Then 14 minus 2 is equal to 12. 12 minus 4 is equal to 8. And then on the very last loop, 8 minus 5 is equal to 3. And so our missing number is 3. And you can see it works. And like this approach, this like solution, this technique, whatever you want to call it, it'll work for every single possible input format. And so hopefully that kind of made some sense. And that's about it. And so we're pretty much done here. One last thing, if you guys are curious, there's another way to do this problem. It implements a sort method. I'm gonna explain it really quickly right now, but you guys can leave now because it's also 110. So this is another solution. The reason why like you guys don't need to really worry about this is because it uses sort, which we didn't talk about yet. But what sort does is it's a built-in Python function that sorts all numbers in an array from ascending order. So if, for example, we were giving the numbers like 5, 4, 2, 1, num.sort was sorted into 1, 2, 4, 5. If this doesn't make sense, it's fine. But now this part is a bit confusing, but you need to keep track of an index. So what this does is if we have a sorted array of numbers and there's a missing number, each number should be equal to index, and then index will be incremented each time. And if it's ever not equal to index, we're going to print and we're going to break. We also didn't teach break yet, but that's also fine. So basically you're going to loop through and you're going to check if the number's not equal to index. And if it's not equal to index, that's your missing number. And you're going to print out x minus 1. And you're going to break. What break does is it exits the for loop. So it just exits the loop. And then if it didn't work, what you're going to do is you're going to increment index plus 1. So once again, like an example. So if n was equal to 5, and on this side, the input this time was 5, 4, 2, 1. So what num.sort would do is it would sort it into 1, 2, 4, 5. And then when you loop each time, you're checking if x is not equal to index. So if 1 is not equal to 1. So obviously 1 is equal to 1, so nothing happens, right? You increment index, and then you check the next integer. So if 2 is not equal to 2, it's equal, so nothing happens, you increment index, right? This is where you increment it. And then now you check if 4 is not equal to 3. And so this is where there's an error, right? Because 4 is not equal to 3. So what happens then is you print out 4 minus 1, which is equal to 3, and you break. And that's how this loop works. And this is the same exact thing implemented in a while loop. I'm not going to get into it, but it's identical. It uses the same exact theory, the same exact solution method, except it's just in a while loop format. If this file doesn't make sense, it's okay. Once again, we'll post these up later on GitHub and you guys can play around with it, test it out, see how it works. But basically that's it. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks. If you guys have any questions, you guys can stay behind. Okay, I'm gonna assume no one else has any questions, so I'm just gonna end the meeting. See you guys in 2 weeks.